In this narrated PowerPoint, we will talk a little bit about how to evaluate and interpret your MCAT score. So first things first, what is your overall score? And is it a score that perhaps is what you were expecting? Just as a point of reference, the actual scores that students receive on the exam are typically 1 to 2 points lower than your average practice exam score. So when you think about whether or not this was a score that you expected, for example, if you regularly received about a 514 on your practice exams, that seemed to be, when you took multiple exams, you seem to kind of always hone in around a 514, then a real or an actual score of 512 to 513 is what your expected score would be. So obviously it's a little bit lower than your practice, but it typically bears out that due to the stress of the exam day and just kind of nerves and things like that, most people will score 1 to 2 points lower. So if that is what happened to you, then that is your expected score. It's also important to think about your sub-scores. So maybe your overall exam score was solid and was where you thought it would or should be. If any of your subsections are prohibitively low, which is generally sort of below the 70th percentile, then even if your overall score is fine, is solid, is competitive, you may still find some struggle when it comes to gaining acceptance if one of your subscores are in a range that the medical schools would have significant concern about. So speaking about that, how does one determine if your score is actually competitive? To some extent, this is going to depend on your expected school range and where you were aiming to apply. So typically the top 15 to 20 schools in the country have an average MCAT for their accepted students in about the 518 to 520 range. Applicants with scores kind of 512 to 517 typically can find a reasonable sort of group or cluster of schools that they can apply to where their scores would certainly be predictive of acceptance and would be a competitive score to have. If you are scoring in the 510 to 511 range, you may struggle a little bit to find average MCAT scores of accepted students that match that range. That's a little bit on the lower end. But depending on, for example, your state of residence, maybe if your GPA is super high, but your MCAT is a little bit lower, you have phenomenal extracurriculars, potentially this could still be a workable score. Generally speaking, scores of 509 or lower are typically not predictive of acceptance. There's always the story of, the great accomplishment, the great, person who kind of had a score that was much lower and got in, but the odds of that happening are not terribly high. And so scores below 509, generally we would be recommending that the student consider retaking the exam. So speaking of retaking, how do you decide if this is something that you should or could be aiming towards or doing? First, is your score acceptable on a broad level? Are you willing to apply to the schools that would most likely be in your range? And how do you sort of weigh out for yourself, what is my score? What does that mean for the schools that I might be accepted at? And how do I place my value on what my school list might be versus the time and the energy that it might take to mount a retake of the MCAT? Where do your kind of priorities weigh out in that way? Are you really, really driven towards a cluster of schools for which your score isn't competitive? And if the answer to that is yes, then it may be worth it to you to put in the additional time and energy to consider a retake so that you know that you left everything on the table, that you certainly put forth your very, very best effort, you gave it your all. Of course, as we know with medical school, nothing is 100% guaranteed. Even with a retake, you still might not get into your dream school, but sometimes just that feeling of, I know I gave it everything, is really reassuring to students. So you may wish to retake the exam so that you know that you gave yourself the best possible shot of admission at these top schools. If any of your subsections are lower than the 70th 70th to 75th percentile, again, depending on where you're aiming, this could cause concern even if your overall score is strong. So unfortunately, we have had students in the past who have needed to retake their MCAT, not because their total score was prohibitive, but because one section really went haywire and they needed to demonstrate strength in that section in order to move forward with their application. Other things to consider. Do you have the capacity at this point to do better? So did something odd happen on the day of the exam? Like maybe you were testing in the 514 range on every single one of your practice tests, but your score that came back was a 509 because you were very nervous, because you were physically ill, because there were loud noises, there were other distractions. So one question to ask yourself is sort of, can I do better? And within what time frame would I be able to retake and show a better score? Again, revisit those practice scores. Did your practice scores, knowing that most people will drop 1 to 2 points, did that actually predict your total score? And so it wasn't sort of a fluky day, and if you take it again, it should go better, but that to really, really move that needle, you're going to have to sink in quite a bit of additional time and study. That is something to be considering as well. Also, how was your study strategy? Did you really focus? Did you give this exam the time that it needed, the energy that it needed? Do you feel like you have anything left to give with a possible rescore or with a possible retake of the exam? Sometimes students will say, I worked my tail off, I did everything, I was super focused on this. Sometimes you might know that you didn't give it everything that you may have otherwise. Another factor to consider with retaking: what would you be giving up if you do decide to retake your exam? Certainly we know that studying for the MCAT takes a lot of time, a lot of dedication, a lot of energy. So what do you no longer have time for if you elect to retake it? Do you have, honestly, the emotional space to relaunch your study as well? If this exam was really, really draining, you might not have the sort of emotional or just, kind of fortitude to do it again, to face it again. It might be the last thing that you want to do. In which case, it might make sense to think about a different timeline, maybe a different application cycle. So we'll kind of get into that in a moment as well, but it's important to think about, do you have the time and do you have sort of the emotional willingness to go through this again? What will you not be able to do if you need to retake the exam? And is that sacrifice worth it to you? So maybe you're going to want to look to retake it over the upcoming summer. What were your summer plans already? And do you have the time and the space to be able to really commit to retaking the exam? That's going to be a really important factor for you to be considering. Speaking of when to retake it, what is the timeline that you're going to be looking at in order, again, to be able to really move that needle? Typically, it's not sort of worth it to retake the exam unless you would get a 2 to 3 point jump in score. And so do you feel like you have the time needed to be able to make that jump? Also important to think about, do you perhaps consider moving your application cycle? When we often get asked, should I retake it? Are schools okay with us retaking it? Do they not like to see retakes? And the medical schools are absolutely fine with seeing a retake. They understand that sometimes things go a little haywire, sometimes the exam's not what you were expecting. I haven't done the pure math on it, but I would guess that probably 40 to 50% of our students do wind up retaking the exam, and that's absolutely fine. What the schools are looking for is, what is your thought process? What is your decision making? So if you retake it in a reasonable time frame and that your score goes up 2, 3 more points, that's great. And the medical schools really aren't going to bat an eye at that one way or the other. However, if you do a panicked retake, so we're already towards the end of April right now, If you're thinking about applying this upcoming summer, you're just getting your MCAT score back, it's not where you were expecting, and you panic and retake it again in 3 weeks and get the same score or get a lower score, but you really are trying to keep applying this year, and so you take it again in June. It's not even about the score at that point that the medical schools have a concern about. It's about your decision making and your ability to sort of handle a challenge and respond to it in a reasonable way. A medical school would much prefer to see that, okay, you get your score back and it's late April, it's early May, you don't feel that you would be able to take another exam prior to launching your application, and so you wait for a year and maybe you retake it in September, you retake it in June or next spring, or I'm sorry, January or next spring. That's something that they're going to be looking at as evidence of the way that you work through a problem and make sure to not continue repeating mistakes. So if you are currently planning on going forward in the applications process, how much wiggle room do you sort of have right now? There are definitely some factors that you will want to consider when we think ahead to the application timeline. If your score is currently reasonable for acceptance, so maybe you have, for example, a 512, certainly a reasonable score to have when you're thinking about applying to medical schools. But maybe your school list is going to vary depending on the retake score. So maybe you were really trying to aim for closer to a 516, 517, but clearly a 512 is a competitive score to apply with depending on the range of schools. What you could do is still submit your application in June so that you are on that early wave of the verification process and your application can get processed pretty quickly. List only a couple of schools. So what are a couple of schools, maybe your home state schools or some other schools that you've thought about that would be reasonable for the current score that you have? Retake the exam in June or early July, and then when those scores come back, you could add on additional schools. So a lot of times students say, you know, does this really mess me up in the timeline process? Remember that the biggest thing that we need to get done in June is that AMCAS application submitted and verified. You won't be receiving secondary applications from the medical schools until typically July into early August. So if you apply to a couple of schools in June, your AMCAS is ready to go, and then in July, when you get your scores back, you add in some additional schools. Your AMCAS does not need to be re-verified. It simply needs to be submitted to those additional schools. So they'll see your AMCAS the very next day, can reasonably get those secondaries out to you. And as long as you're committed to turning those secondaries back in ASAP, you're really not losing too much ground when it comes to the application process. If your score, though, is currently not in an acceptable range, trying to retake it this summer and apply immediately is quite risky to do. So remember that as soon as you click that AMCAS button, you are technically an applicant for any school that is on your list. So say you are willing to take the risk, you apply, you put a ton of schools down on your AMCAS application, you pay for all of those schools, and then your MCAT score comes back and it's still not a good score for the types of schools that you're aiming towards. Now you've got a couple of problems. First of all, you could persist with your application, spend more money on all of your secondaries, and maybe you'll get in, maybe you won't. You could also elect to stop your application at that point. So your AMCAS is submitted, but you're not going to do any secondaries because you know your odds of acceptance aren't high. You are still going to be a reapplicant at all of those schools that you had originally put on your list. And again, when you think about how medical schools look at your behavior and your decision making, they will see, okay, first MCAT score came back, the person rushed to retake it, still moved forward with their application, the score didn't come back a second time in an acceptable range, and now the student has not gained any admission to the schools that they had applied to and are reapplying. that's just a whole lot of kind of risky behaviors and assumptions and, sort of the impression of panic that makes medical schools nervous. So if you're getting a score back right around this time of year, it's late April, early May, you're getting a score back that is prohibitively low, we would really, really encourage you to consider, does it make more sense to wait an additional year, take the MCAT in a more thoughtful and planned way, and then be able to move forward with an application next year. So we would definitely encourage you to think through those things and really do some good research using the MSAR, the Medical School Admission Requirements resource online. That's a great way to look at the ranges of scores that various schools have and determine, where am I competitive and am I okay with those schools? And then ultimately make the decision between launching a retake and doing it now versus doing it several months from now and potentially reapplying, or not reapplying, but potentially moving your application to a future admission cycle. So we hope that this information has been helpful in assessing and kind of considering your MCAT score. We're always happy to chat with you about it further, either through our walk-ins, which are Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday from 2:30 to 4:30 in the BSLC lobby. And we will continue to do those up until the week of finals. We don't do walk-ins during finals week. We also will begin applicant-specific walk-ins in May, and we'll be sending out emails to you with the information on how to access that time frame as well. Those will be on Friday afternoons across selected dates in May and June. So we'll be sure to send out additional emails about that to announce the dates and also the registration information for that online resource. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.